Yeah, I think this one is different. It's just about kind of the books I've written and stuff, and some comments about there. I'm happy to share anything. I just wanted to make sure everybody is aware this is a session about just kind of open-ended about the books and stuff, and not a sort of technical instruction section here. But David, did you want to say anything else? You want me just to launch into it here?
So I just posted the link to sign up for the book there. I'll also be posting it often throughout the session, just because some people come and go, and it's
Fantastic.
good to have it top of mind. But James has already asked a question. There is a Q&A section down there at the bottom if you'd like to ask
Yeah.
questions there, asking what's the difference between Jenkins and Jenkins X.
Oh, that's a good question, James. And so Jenkins is the traditional sort of orchestration workflow tool out there. There's actually a couple incarnations, and I'll try. If I start rambling on too much, someone can throw a virtual fruit at me or something like that, or yell or something. But basically, Jenkins was the original sort of workflow thing to automate things like builds and stuff. The guy who created it actually said he got tired of being the person who wrote the builds. So he wrote it, and it was a big web. It was a web interface tool, and you would go into the web, and you would select drop downs. You would fill in radio buttons or fill in forms, those kinds of things. Jenkins 2, which is what the book was about, the second book that I wrote, was more along the lines of kind of explaining some of the basics of Jenkins, but also talking about pipelines as code. That is the idea that being able to create these pipelines that take your code from source code through the build process, through the testing process, through other kinds of validation stuff to produce something that is a deployable product. Being able to do that in Jenkins, but being able to write it like you might write a program or you might write a script out there, and being able to store it in source management systems like Git and such. So that was kind of the focus of that, pipelines as code, as opposed to tying a bunch of web jobs and web forms together to do your pipeline. Jenkins X bears very little resemblance to Jenkins even these days. This was the idea that we want to be able to create these CI/CD pipelines, these continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines, to take our code from that source code through the build, test, all the processes, and be able to automatically deploy it into Kubernetes. And any of you who've heard the Kubernetes term know about containers. Jenkins X simplifies taking your code and automatically packaging it up as a container, wrapping it up. For those of you who know what Helm is, generating Helm charts and stuff with it, and deploying it out into the Kubernetes cluster and running it there. So in essence, you can create the CI/CD pipelines in any of the clouds, any of the Kubernetes environments with just a couple of commands in there. And it's actually the topic of my next book, but it's on hold right now while the company that works with Jenkins X CloudBees is kind of revamping the product. We're going on there. So I've got probably 3/4 of it written, but we're waiting for them to kind of get to the next version to see what they change so I can finish that up. But dumb it down for an ops guy.
There is
No, you
actually a
guys are doing the
question.
real work there, huh?
Those are fighting words, so I'm just going to ignore that.
Yeah, yeah,
There's
exactly,
a
exactly.
question from Patrick that says, "Are there any new trends on branching strategies like Git flow or trunk-based development?"
Oh wow. New trends, not so much that I know of. I mean, GitFlow has been out there for a long time in terms of branching. I tried to kind of steer clear of that in the professional Git book that I wrote in terms of espousing one or the other. I will say there is a book called, well, this called Accelerate, written by the DevOps Institute. Excuse me, not one of my books, but done by the DevOps Institute, and they talk about the key things that they have found, which are useful to companies and have really helped accelerate them and help accelerate their growth and stuff. DevOps practices, and their position is always use the trunk. Work on the trunk or the master branch in Git and work in there, and then branch out from there. But I don't know if there's any new trends out there. Certainly get the work, the typical workflows and stuff have been out there, get flow for a while in there. I think though, in general, as long as you're working off of the master branch, you're probably up with where people like the DevOps Institute and stuff would say you are should be working. Sorry, I've got some sunlight coming in here on me. Going to
Yeah,
highlight.
it seems like a very difficult life that you're leading, right there, trying to avoid sunlight.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious what sort of got you into the process of writing this book.
Well, I have the two books. I did the Professional Git one, and I did the Jenkins 2 up and running. See if that helps a little bit. The first one, honestly, I'd always kind of wanted to write a book. I'd been teaching for a number of years, and I guess you would say almost like a bucket list item or something in there. I decided, I enjoyed teaching, enjoyed putting it together, and I said, well, okay, let's see if I can write a book. And honestly, it was a much larger endeavor, but there's a couple of motivation factors. One is I really love teaching and helping people understand things. And so I already had a lot of the material I'd done from Git classes over the years, so I was able to draw that together, use a lot of the same illustrations and stuff. And the other thing, quite honestly, that gets me into doing this kind of stuff, if I have to teach other people, I had better know it myself. So I have to learn it myself and I have to figure it out. And that's a driver for me is okay, I can I feel like I can teach most things if I understand it myself, but I really have to dig to understand it. Um, so it's an interesting process there. It took me, mostly a lot of nights and weekends working on it because my day job, I'm still doing that as well in there, and you don't, I'll say this up front too, you don't do these kinds of books for the money. You do it for, because you want to do it and because you want to actually help other people understand it. And the only kind of the main reward you get from it kind of is the reviews and the kind of feedback and stuff for it. So yeah.
Yeah, so I've been hosting the author track today, and talking with all the authors. Basically, all of them have said something very similar. It's like a passion project. Some of them have said you can go buy it off of Amazon. I won't make any money off of that. One person said that if you bought his book, maybe he could afford a coffee. So that's something. But then he was drinking the coffee while he was giving the talk. So I think in general, he's
Kind
making a net
of
loss
made a
on
wash of
coffees.
it. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I see
Yeah.
James is asking, and I'm sure you get this all the time. What is that behind you?
So that thing behind me is called a bubble wall. There is I don't know if I put a plug in, but a company on Etsy that makes them. It's supposed to be bubbling in all the chambers, and right now there's a couple of them broken. This was a thing that I got from my wife to put in her office, and for some reason she thought it looked better in mine. So there you go. I have it in here, um, but it is just a little decoration or something different in here.
I thought it was maybe a visualization of some commits, and the broken columns were like a build not passive or
I'm
something.
sure you could probably do that. I've known of people I've heard in the past. I think they used like lava lamps and stuff to do that. Like when the lava lamp was red, the build was broken,
Ooh,
that kind of thing. Or when it was green, it was good. So I'm sure they probably do have something with that, or it can change colors periodically. But yeah, that's a good idea. I could actually hook it up if the builds were broken or
oh,
something.
oh,
Yeah,
it's blue now. I don't know what that means, but no,
yeah,
I'm
I
just kidding.
know. I know. Yeah.
John is actually asking, how much easier is it in Jenkins X versus Jenkins file for using different pipeline stages in regular Jenkins? I think there might be a grammar issue, but did you catch that?
I'm not seeing that one. Maybe I'm missing some.
So it's actually, if you scroll to the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A icon.
Yeah. Oh, okay. The Q&A. I'm looking still in the chat. That's what it is. I've been working on. Oh, yeah. Okay, got it. How much easier is it in Jenkins X versus Jenkins file use for pipeline stages in regular Jenkins? It's easier with the Jenkins file out there from the standpoint of once you get it working. Now, what I typically do is I will kind of develop it in Jenkins in a pipeline type of project. And then if that's what you're asking, John, I'll typically go into Jenkins and write my code in the application itself as a pipeline type of project, which allows me to kind of test it, embed it there, and then I'll go and save it off as a Jenkins file. If you're writing with Jenkins file, for those of you who aren't familiar with what a Jenkins file is, it's essentially your pipeline expressed as code, much like a program in there. You can either write the code in Jenkins itself in a pipeline project, or you can just store it in a Jenkins file and store that in Git as a text file. And the challenge with it, if you only ever do it as a Jenkins file starting out, is you've got to then kind of put it somewhere where Jenkins can see it and run it, typically in Git, and try to exit. And then if you have a problem with it, go back and use an editor to update it and such. There are some ways you can kind of get around that a little bit, but I typically develop it as a pipeline project in Jenkins itself, and then store it out, convert that to a Jenkins file when I'm sure it's running well. Let's see, go with questions. We currently use regular Jenkins to create images and deploy to OpenShift. We use Kubernetes. Is this something that would be an easy transition from regular Jenkins pipeline stored in source code repositories? If by regular Jenkins, you mean just the traditional kind of non-pipeline or non-pipeline as code Jenkins out there, it can be a little bit, I mean, if you can express it in what you do, it can be a little bit of a transition there. Essentially, I was trying to remember, I think there is something, I think there's a plugin that allows you to actually take Jenkins projects and convert them to pipeline as code. Depending kind of on the complexity, it might be a bit of a challenge. I mean, one thing you might do is start just to kind of stub out a pipeline code in a pipeline project, and then kind of fill it in with the pieces as you go along, and maybe add that processing in as you go along. There are examples I have in the book of how to do that, so you might take a look at those. That might help as well.
I think
Was
John,
asking if they could be an easy transition to Jenkins X. Oh, I see what you're saying. Now, so sorry, John, I didn't understand the question quite. You already have the pipelines as code. It it should be. The answer is it should be. But here's what's happened. Jenkins X originally had two ways of doing Jenkins things. One was by using a Jenkins instance to run. In other words, when it needed to do a pipeline processing, it would spin up a Jenkins instance, and it would actually run things with the pipeline as code, and it would go through and do that. Over time, they've moved away from that. They've actually deprecated it, which is kind of an unfortunate take from my standpoint. They've gone to something called Tekton pipelines. Tekton, if you haven't heard of it, Tekton, is a way of writing pipelines more as Kubernetes aspects. Kubernetes native. They use actually Kubernetes kind of primitives and stuff to write pipelines in there. Jenkins X will do all that for you. It'll produce your pipeline. My point being, when they were actually running with a Jenkins master, a separate instance of Jenkins, you could have taken your pipeline code and pretty much just used that option through Jenkins X. But since they've now deprecated it and gone to using Tekton pipelines, it's not as easy. But you could probably still, if you spend a little time learning some of the stuff they do and things, there is a language that they use. So Jenkins X will actually allow you to do write your pipelines in a language that is similar to the declarative syntax of Jenkins X, of Jenkins 2, if you know that. So there is a way to write your pipelines in a similar syntax, and then Jenkins X will turn it into Tekton. So probably not too far off, but it's not as easy as just picking them up and dropping them in. You'd have to spend a little time making sure you could translate it. Let's see, what else do we have?
James is asking about your day job, which you're under no obligation to answer. Is SAS into Kubernetes?
I guess I can talk a little bit about this, and understanding that if I I do not represent SAS here in this capacity. I mean, I'll talk, but my day job is a R&D director at a DevOps organization. SAS is doing, yeah, we're doing a lot with Kubernetes now. We are coming out with a new set of software, our Avaya software, that will be cloud native and run there. So this has been an interesting journey going from something that wasn't cloud native to that. And really, we've kind of really kicked into high gear with our DevOps organization and doing a lot of exciting things. And that's really, if you really want to learn, you know, Kubernetes, those kinds of things, DevOps, take something that wasn't designed for that and then convert it to do that. Take something, a piece of software that wasn't initially designed to run in a cloud native way, in a stateless way, and work on converting it. And you'll learn a lot that way. Yeah.
Boy, that would be funny if the answer to that question was like, we just don't believe in Kubernetes at SAS. We, don't really use it at all.
No, no, we are fully on board with the cloud native and making sure our customers can run it in the software and cloud native and take advantage of all the functions out there. Yeah.
That's awesome. So anybody else with any questions, feel free to ask them either in the chat or in the Q&A section of Zoom here. I see that we actually have really high attendance. I think this is the best attended talk that we've had in the author track
Oh,
today. So congratulations.
well, fantastic. I appreciate that. Yeah. And so hopefully, I don't know if most people are interested in the Git book or the Jenkins 2 book. Oh, it says, is Jenkins X free and can we download it? Yes, you can. John, you can actually download Jenkins X and you can download it and play with it. And actually, there's about first 4 chapters of the Jenkins X book, I think, out on O'Reilly, early preview. I think it mostly still applies now if you're interested. And there's also classes I do on O'Reilly around some of these topics as well. So yeah, yeah,
Awesome. I will mark that as answered.
yep.
I'm kind of
Uh,
curious, like,
Go ahead.
so you wrote both of these books. Do you see a lot of overlap in the audience for both books, or are they really targeted at different groups?
Really, probably targeted at different groups out there. I mean, the Git book, I wrote it. Actually, I wrote both of them kind of as for the beginner, for the advanced. But I think the Git book has gotten a lot more feedback on it. I will say it's been interesting that I worked with Wiley and Sons for the Git book, and great people to work with there. O'Reilly, that was Wiley, not O'Reilly, but Wiley, and then O'Reilly I did the Jenkins 2 book with, and really, you kind of get the to see the marketing and stuff that goes along with like the OzCon, the conferences, different things they used to have, not so much anymore. But for instance, the Jenkins 2 book, while it hasn't had perhaps as great reviews and stuff because of some of the screenshots and issues with that. By the way, if you get the Jenkins 2 book, I highly recommend asking for the electronic version, that, because the screenshots got kind of washed out when they printed it. But hopefully the electronic version I think still looks pretty good. But anyway, with the Jenkins 2 book, what I was getting at was they actually translated that one, surprised me, into Chinese, Korean, and Russian. So I have copies of all of those. Can't read a word out of any of it except my name, but I can, so they got translated into other countries, and I was really interesting. They had me write forwards for that and stuff. So that was really nice. The professional Git book, I would say, has probably gotten wider attention there. Typically, when I go to conferences, people are more interested in that. Um, Different approaches on them, or with the professional Git book, I included like hands-on labs and wrote it with like, beginner sections and then advanced topics and stuff, kind of choose from that. The Jenkins book is bigger, but kind of goes through some of the original Jenkins stuff and explains some of that. And then through the newer pieces on the end kind of builds all the way through, but you can kind of skip around in it a little more. So yeah, interesting experiences all the way around.
So John is asking, what about posting a link for the Git book? So it's interesting. We have this forum, and I will post the link again in the chat. Um, and the forum, the the book that the forum says you'll be expressing interest in is Profession Get Jenkins 2 up and running. Um,
That's
I,
2 books.
I don't know. Well, it's one book and one misspelled book, so I don't know exactly which book you will be getting a copy of. I think this is something that All Things Open is coordinating. Um,
Yeah, we'll have to kind of make sure. I would say when you put it in, if you have a way, express which book you want to actually, you're interested in. Maybe that can make sure that's the case. I don't know how
Hopefully
many
they're
we will
sending out
have.
both, books, but
Yeah.
I don't actually know. So I am a lowly volunteer moderator, and I actually have very little influence in All Things Open, and I'm getting paid very poorly. So
Volunteers are fantastic. Couldn't do it without you guys. I mean, honestly, this is great. But yeah, if you actually just search for my name out on Amazon, you'll be able to find it. You'll be able to see the book out there. That's probably the easiest way. I started to post a link, but it's taking me to kind of some of the other pages here. But it's professional Git, and then Jenkins 2 up and running is the other one. So if you look for my name out there, you'll find it. Yeah.
awesome. Well, fingers crossed. I hope that you get the book that you want. But even if you don't, maybe you'll get the book that you needed. Um, we have a
Yeah.
question here from Lakshmi, who asks, "Is Jenkins X something comparable to Circle CI? Could you talk a little bit about the ecosystem?"
I'm not familiar with Circle CI really, although as I recall, it's one of those continuous integration, continuous delivery things. But I would be, speaking out of a lack of knowledge if I try to talk about it too much. Jenkins X is more about setting up the pipelines to run in a cloud environment, whereas something like Jenkins, or I'm thinking Circle CI or Travis is another one out there people integrate with. Those are all sort of the defining the pipelines themselves, like the build, tests, and processes such in there. Whereas Jenkins X tries to take it to the standpoint of being able to deploy your app and run it into Kubernetes environments. So, for example, if you have has a promotion model, I can have my app, I can create it, and it has quick starts and stuff that I can bring import in, and it will create a Docker container for you if you don't have one. Wrap your app in a container. It will create the Helm charts to deploy it into Kubernetes. It will create a namespace in Kubernetes and deploy your app out there and run. It will allow you to connect up through the Visual Studio IDE stuff out there and be able to debug into it. So Jenkins X is really about getting your app into that containerized Kubernetes environment and running it out there. It does build a pipeline, but it really relies on the pipeline stuff isn't as unique or quite as interesting, other than it's using Tecton now, which is getting closer to the Kubernetes kind of primitives. It's basically pipelines expressed kind of as Kubernetes objects out there. So you get some efficiency from that. But it's the pipeline part isn't as much the cool part of Jenkins X as it is about wrapping your app up as the container and getting it out there running in a pod in a cluster in Kubernetes and doing that so you can just be deploying on the clouds.
That makes sense. And just as an update for everyone, it looks like the forum is unfortunately no longer accepting submissions. So I guess they gave away all the books that they had. So I apologize for
I
that.
guess so. Sorry
Wah
about that,
wah.
folks. I would suggest, again, I mean, the books you can sometimes, Amazon seems to vary the price. It seems to run on them there. The electronic ones are cheaper in there. If you do get a book and if you see me sometime at a conference or something, I'm happy to sign it for you once we get back to a place where we can all interact face to face again.
Absolutely. And just there are questions about titles. So there's a book, Jenkins 2 up and running, and then there's another book called Professional Git.
Yep, professional Git as opposed to Pro Git. Now, Pro Git is a good book too by a guy named Scott Chacon out there. I'm not going to tell you my book's the only one out there, the best one or whatever. It's out there. I think it's a good book. I'm biased, but there's other resources out there as well. And as well, if you're interested, if you like the way the professional Git book is written and stuff, I do some classes on O'Reilly and stuff periodically that might be interested in joining in. And I sometimes do one at All Things Open or Open Source 101 called an advanced Git. And we go into actually some advanced features and tools that most people haven't heard about that work with Git, Bisect, and one called Re3 or reuse recorded resolution, different ones out there that might be of interest. So look for that periodically, and we'll hopefully do that again sometime. Folks at All Things Open, Open Source 101, Todd, Danny, those guys are fantastic. And I'm hoping maybe at some point we can do some more Git stuff out there as well.
That's awesome. And this is also a chance for me to plug my book, Amateur Git, which is basically about just getting incredibly frustrated and crafting terrible pull requests, which was the first few months of me using GitHub. No, I'm just kidding. So
Sounds like it could be a book though.
like,
Real life experiences using Git, and yeah,
I
yeah,
don't think it would sell
absolutely,
quite as well as yours. Uh,
yeah.
I did see a note from Matthew asking about the form. So yeah, we were sharing the form every few minutes since the beginning of the presentation. So I guess they just reached the end of the books that they were sending out recently. So I apologize for that. We still do have about 10 minutes left. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them either in the chat or in the Q&A below. I mean, writing two books is a pretty big lift, especially moving between different publishers, right? Learning two different processes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of did the first book, I did Professional Git, and like I said, both of these were written kind of on weekends and evenings in there. So thankfully, my family, was supportive and stuff. Sorry, I'm getting the sun stripes here as I move around.
You're gonna
But
have the
it,
weirdest looking sunburn
I
after
know, I
this
know.
author session.
Yeah, kind of
It's
bouncing
gonna
off.
look like we really grilled you.
Kind of shy. Bounces off my head anyway, but there you go. But interesting, what I was going to say is even with the writing process wasn't as geez, I don't want to use it sound too negative here, wasn't as challenging perhaps as the editing process. You don't think about it as much, but the editors that have the job of, okay, you said it here, what did you mean by it? And no, you can't use the first person here, you have to use second person or third person. Okay, and well, this isn't clear, what does that mean? And the editors, I could not do that job. I mean, that is, they are reading through, Lord knows, bunches of stale, sort of dry material about all these things they could probably care less about. But
Don't oversell your book now, Brent.
it is what it is. You can read the reviews out there. The Git review is pretty
I'm
good.
just kidding.
The Jenkins X books, people complain about the snapshot or the screenshots. Now, I just mean as an editor, you're not interested in the material probably, but
Right,
you're going through
right.
and having to edit it in there too. But the editing process seemed to take forever, and that's the hardest challenge I had with that. I've written a few articles as well. If you look out on O'Reilly and opensource.com and search for my name, you'll find articles on various topics, Jenkins, Garrett, Git, CI/CD. There's a nice CI difference between between continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment out on O'Reilly's site, some stuff on open source. Anyway, point being, those are fairly easy to write and do diagrams and stuff for, but it's challenging to do the editing. That seems to take a long time and takes a lot of effort in there.
Well, actually, we have a question on that topic. I just do want to reach out to Matthew in the chat again. You know, if you do want to uh, ask for a copy of the book, I would reach out to the organizers, the conference organizers, and see if you could email them and get an exception or something. But John is actually has a question about the book writing process. Um,
Yeah. How long does it normally take for a publisher, once accepted, to actually get the book printed and out for sale? If you're talking about from the final draft to getting it available, I would say probably at least 3 months. From there, I know if they told me if I had gotten the Jenkins X book, I think in September, it would have been out by the end of the year. So probably something on the order of 3 months to get it printed and out for sale. Overall, I generally, I think it's taken me about a year to write each one, which, in technology terms is forever. And that's one of the challenges of writing one of these books is you got to keep up with the technology. I mean, I'm doing, Googling to find information of what's new, and hopefully if you can get in with somebody like on the Jenkins side, which I was fortunate to do in Jenkins 2, not as much in Jenkins X, to find people who were inside who could explain to me, this is what's coming, this is what we're doing, that sort of thing. That makes a lot of difference as well.
That's awesome.
Crystal, let's
I
see,
can read
Chris.
Crystal's question here. So Crystal says, I work for a nonprofit that teaches free programming classes in
Awesome.
Ruby on Rails and React. I am a graduate of their classes and now I'm a mentor. What would be a good way to introduce students to containers as code newbies? That's quite a question. Any feedback on that?
Crystal, I really, I mean, again, I am biased in this, but there are some things on O'Reilly, if you have an O'Reilly subscription and stuff, that are containers and such, with training and such in there that I do and talk about that. If you would like for the nonprofit, Crystal, I'm happy to, come sometime or do a virtual presentation maybe of one of those classes in there. If we and we could probably do something that would simplify what I do, and I do uh, like a 6-hour class for O'Reilly. We wouldn't have to do something like that. But if you're interested, contact me. You can through LinkedIn or Twitter or something, direct message, and I can set up something with that, and maybe we could talk about it. And happy to help. Always happy to help people learn more about it, especially nonprofit. Thank you for doing that.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that generous offer. I'm always interested in the approach to teaching people about containers because when I was first doing software development, there were no containers, and
Right.
so a lot of the abstractions that I know, containers are kind of annoying intermediary to getting things to production. But at the
Yeah.
same time, for people who are coming into the software industry now, containers, I mean, it's just like a de facto part of life. And my first instinct was to say like, oh, don't talk too much about containers, it might confuse them. But I think maybe that's just me projecting. People doing cloud native development in the next few years, maybe containers will
Yeah.
just be second nature.
I think it will be. I've seen that in my own and SaaS where I work, as people have kind of gotten used to. Wasn't that long ago, Kubernetes and stuff were just these funny words and
Hmm.
such, and now it's almost like second nature. I think it's like anything, right? A new operating system or a new technology, programming language or something. Eventually, you have to kind of you get a handle on it and get a feel for it. One of the tenets I kind of have with teaching things is I like to do animations, like to use analogies to help people understand things, and these hands-on labs where you can actually try some things out. I try to make it very sort of handheld because I believe honestly people teach themselves a lot. You can listen to somebody rattle on me or somebody else about containers, Kubernetes stuff, but it's when you actually get to, well, for me at least, when you get to actually practice it and try it out and kind of relate it to things that you know about, that's kind of when the learning happens, I think, in there.
I'm still
Yeah.
old school. I don't trust any storage media that you can't bend. You know.
I've still got a bunch of floppies somewhere, I think, up there, 5 and a quarters or something up there
Yeah,
somewhere.
yeah. There you go. There you go.
Yeah, I've got
Well,
some somewhere. Yeah.
we've got a follow up here from Lakshmi who says, "Thank you for clarifying on how wonderful Jenkins X is. Are there any constraints? Are we looking for a specific prerequisites like we should be using Terraform?"
That's a great question, Lakshmi. So, and in terms of how wonderful, I would say, wonderful, I guess, depending on if it works for you or not. It's a complex project, and I don't want to paint just as a utopia here because there are so many moving parts in terms of how it works and stuff in there. It can still be a little challenging in there. That's why I was trying to write the book about it to help clarify with that. But when it works, it is very nice to go from simple commands out to having things deployed in the clouds. Any constraints on it? Yeah, I mean, even now they're revamping it to do a version 3 of it, which is why the book's kind of on hold with that. And they used to have functionality, for example, in Jenkins X, a command that would let you create a cluster, spin up a cluster for you automatically on Google or on, any of the cloud providers out there. But what they've done now is they said, yeah, that's not really the right way to do it. We really should be having people use other things like Terraform. So now they're pushing more for people to use Terraform to create the cluster, and then you actually install Jenkins X running in the cluster and do your work there. So they've kind of gradually moving away from this thing of having Jenkins X, be the answer to everything and try to do it all, to saying, no, you should use more standard tools like Terraform out there. So there are some constraints around, or I'd say some changes to how they do things where they're allowing more other tools to do it.
That's awesome. I see we have a question from Peter. What about 8-inch or cassette drives? Yes, those are, Peter, you're very intuitive. Those are the recommended media for continuous integration and deployment. So yeah, everyone out there who is using solid state drives and random access memory, you're missing out on a really fun time deploying software from a cassette drive.
One of my first jobs in college was as a operator at a bank at night, and we used to have the 8-inch drives and stuff. I used to have to go and run their computers, run their backups and stuff, and all that. So sorry, lapsing back into the Wayback Machine here, but
So Crystal has a follow-up and relative relating to the nonprofit,
yeah.
um, saying we have people using their own computers and spend a lot of time troubleshooting for different systems. For some projects, it could be nice to use a container so they could focus on the app code rather than getting stuck on setup. I mean, that's a really great point.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. What?
personally, I work for IBM and we do a lot of labs with students. And as soon as you start working with somebody's local environment, you run into all sorts of issues with paths and versions and stuff like that. So that I really like that idea because you're kind of leveraging the
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
universality of containers to help
mm-hmm.
with education.
Absolutely. And what I do, and pretty much all, and by the way, I used to work for IBM back in the early 90s, a long time ago. But what I do with all my classes and labs is typically I'll have a virtual machine which runs on a program called VirtualBox out there. And the virtual machine has everything configured and everything set up for it, because there's no way in the time we have to get everything set up for people. Now, VirtualBox has its own challenges out there, and they're large images, but it's actually worked out pretty well. We had the workshop today, and I think we had 100 people still by the end of this class or so. But we run into technical things, but we've kind of figured out how to get around them. But I don't ever try to get everything set up on everybody's computer unless it's Git. If it's just a Git class, that's pretty easy to. But anything with Kubernetes, I use a virtual machine that has Minikube running and things like Istio installed or Docker, all those different things automatically. So yeah, I agree.
That's awesome. We just
Yeah.
have a few more minutes, so if you have any
Yeah.
other questions, feel free to stick them in Q&A. Feel free to stick them in the chat. We do have one from John. John is
Yeah.
not playing around. He references a particular version number, but he says, when you talk about Jenkins 2 as in your book, are you referring to the open source Jenkins that is out and currently at LTS version 2.249.1?
John, it's not going to be at that latest version because the Jenkins 2 book came out a couple of years back in there, although I do believe that most things should still apply. When I do a couple of classes on O'Reilly, like building a deployment pipeline with Jenkins 2 and such, and I usually update it for there. So it should be, as far as I know, everything still works with it. The only things typically they change or they add a feature here or there in the UI and such in there. So yes, it should be that V2, but it probably won't be 249. It won't be the long-term support version there. It's not written specifically for that one. The version it's written for is probably year older or so anyway. So yeah, most of it should still work though.
Awesome. Sounds good. I see that Matthew was asking, you can create, with WebDev, you can create a project for personal use, but it's hard to wrap my head around it, around all these different items. What tasks can I set forth on? So I guess what's a good way to get an introduction to this whole context, this whole environment?
If you're talking about, containers or stuff like that, I recommend the conferences like this, of course, if the workshops and stuff. Really, I'm a big believer in the hands-on kinds of workshops and stuff, not just the lecture portion.
Hmm.
And that's why I really try to do things with the VMs. And I give that to people and say, here's your environment. They have that. then one of the last things I try to remember to tell people, I think I forgot it this time, but in the workshop, is okay, now you've got the VM, you've got the lab documents, go off and try and play with it, work with it. Really, when you get into this, like with learning anything, I find that the hands-on stuff, try something that's not in the labs, try changing something. You can always go back. Usually there's ways to go back in this, see how it works out there. And honestly, I'll tell you, if you really want to learn something, promise to teach it to somebody.
Mm,
It sounds odd, but if you have to teach it to somebody, if you're in charge of teaching it to somebody or helping somebody with it at your work, you're probably going to learn it pretty well. But I would say, get one of these virtual environments or something. There's another one out there, Katacoda, Katacoda. If you haven't looked at Katacoda, look at Katacoda. You can find things, I think O'Reilly just bought them, but Katacoda is an environment and you can spin up things really quickly. Crystal, if you haven't looked at that for your nonprofit, maybe look at that as well. Katacoda is a great little environment to try things out with. If you search for it, you'll find all kinds of links to it and stuff to try things out. So yeah, but definitely, it's if you're just kind of following along, you can kind of get it. Hands-on is better, but if you try things out, try changing things and seeing, oh, what does that do, kind of thing, that'll help you learn it. And also, like I said, if you ever want to, just try to mentor somebody or teach somebody with it, that'll force you to learn it as well. But check
that's
out the
awesome.
Katacoda environments uh, and interactive. Those are great to try some of this stuff out and learn it too.